All right, we're going to get kicked off. Some housekeeping items. There's a Q&A function in the Zoom panel, so please feel free to add questions there or put some pieces on chat. And we'll have a Q&A portion at the end as well to go through all that. But if I see it, notice it, and I have something to tie in, I'll try to get to it. But I promise I will get to them all at some point. All right, so start off. So by way of introduction, so my name is Ryan Pedersen. I'm on the solutions engineering team, and I will be leading the demonstration today. The links for GitHub, LinkedIn, email. If you have any questions, any follow-ups, liked it, hated it, let me know. Okay, on to the agenda. So in terms of what we are planning to cover, this is the breakdown. We're going to start off by setting the stage with the who, the what. We will jump into the underlying architecture, how everything works and is tied together. And then we'll get into the actual product demo. So when we get there, I'll actually level set with a more granular agenda. But for now, just know we'll jump into the full demo. And if you're wondering who this demo is for, here we go. The developers. So there are going to be plenty to gain for developers around agility and empowerment. DevSecOps, so generally security teams, will cover how to make sure everyone follows policies, how to manage risk, and then platform engineering, developer experience, what we can do for enablement, cost control, and visibility. And beyond that, some themes that we'll be hitting on during this demo. First, you can expect to understand how everything works. This is a demo after all. We'll want to talk about developer happiness, which loosely translate to quick feedback and letting developers focus on their jobs and not CI/CD. Then ensuring adherence to security policies, and finally, how you gain visibility. Now that we've set the stage on that, let's go ahead and define some terms. These are all things that we're going to touch on in more detail, but I want to introduce them here just to define them before we really get into it. So starting off with the important concept of config as code. Everything we're going to see is going to be defined in a config file. In terms of the important terms and how they relate, let's define them. The highest level is the pipeline. When we're saying pipeline, you can think of it as all of the workflows triggered on your project with the relevant parameters. You can really think of it as your config itself, the relevant context from the trigger, and then the body of work needed to validate. Workflows coordinate a set of related work from start to finish. So it's the orchestration of jobs, which job is running into which order. A job is a collection of steps run inside of an execution environment that you specify. And a step is the smallest segment of work, just a command run during a job. So again, all this is defined in the config file and source control. You might be happy because you love config as code. You might also be worried about looking for a way to apply some guardrails. Config policy management is a way to enforce org and project-wide policies on configurations. It allows administrators and operators to write and manage rules. You can either block processing or just log usage for different violations. And we'll get into this in much more detail later. Now, some flexibility with those guardrails attached. I said each job is defined in the config file, and the job is a collection of steps in an execution environment. With CircleCI, there are a lot of options for you to choose from in terms of environments. You can choose from one of our cloud environments, so Docker, Mac, Windows, VM, GPU, ARM, really you name it, or it can be your own self-hosted runner. We see a workflow using a lot of them together over on the left. On top of that, for our cloud resources, we have a large variety of resource classes available. See an example, Docker executor resource over on the right. It could be anywhere from 20 CPU, 40 gigs of RAM down to 1 CPU, 2 gigs of RAM. So it really lets you find your perfect Goldilocks zone. In the config, you could absolutely script out all of the commands you want in the environment that you specify, but you can also think dry and utilize orbs. So orbs are CircleCI's package manager. They are reusable configuration as code. Think best practices, custom scripting, all these things bundled up into few or single lines of configuration. And here we have a few examples from our registry of partner and CircleCI orbs to help you accomplish whatever goals you have. All right, now that we've covered the basics, let's get on to the demo. Let me change my screen. And hopefully everyone can see the documentation page. If not, please put something in the chat that I've completely fumbled. Perfect. In terms of the product demo, what we're going to see, what you can expect by happenstance is all mirrors the docs pretty well. Nothing I'm telling you is impossible to find yourself here, but I want to highlight the most relevant pieces that I see high-performing teams focused on. So coming away, I want you to feel like you have a focused list of must-dos when onboarding to CircleCI. Our journey today is going to start by seeing those terms in the config hierarchy in CircleCI. Then we'll follow a change through a pipeline. So running security checks, testing, building, pushing an image, getting it out to a dev cluster where we can do some end-to-end testing on it. Here we'll be hitting on speed, scalability, security. Beyond that, we'll dig deeper into the config itself. So how to make it more reusable, how to use third-party tools. And finally, we'll jump into insights. Then there'll be plenty of time at the end for questions. And I also have a few other different kinds of use cases that we can go through. I'm going to jump into the pipelines page, talk a bit about the pieces that we talked about in terms of the config hierarchy. So as an operator, the pipelines page is where I get a bird's eye view of what's going on across the org. A filter at the project, the branch level by past and failed workflows. Again, a pipeline is just all the workflows triggered on your project with the relevant parameters. They're kicked off when there's a commit. I can kick a new one off with the API, or I can kick a new one off in the UI from the head of a branch that I've selected with some additional optional parameters that I want to add. Inside of an older pipeline, I can also rerun the workflow tied to the original trigger. So this one's going to be tied to this original SHA here. And then we're going to see a huge amount of workflows running at a big team. Running CircleCI, you can have unlimited horizontal scale, so developers don't need to queue or wait for build resources. Why that's important to us is by eliminating queuing and having that ability to scale, you can increase deployment frequency. You don't need to worry about when on and off hours might be. Just commit when you're ready. One level down from here is going to be the workflow. Jump in here, workflow, again, is just the orchestration of jobs. Each box that we see here is a job. They're each their own independent, ephemeral environment. They're spun up on demand and torn down after, not reusing them ever. They could each be their own platform, again, with differing levels of vertical scale. So I can have all these be different things: Docker, machine, Windows, self-hosted, cloud-hosted, ARM, GPU, Mac, you name it. Because there's so many options, platform teams know they're able to support whatever the developers in the org throws their way. And something important here beyond the flexibility in terms of architecture is that ephemeral nature. So each job is totally isolated and doesn't know about another unless we tell it to. And they each focus on the right resource for the specific thing that they need to accomplish. And jobs, I mentioned, is a collection of steps that are run on top of an execution environment. Coming in here to highlight a couple things that make life easier in terms of navigation and troubleshooting. I can see the environment up here. I'm running this inside of a Docker image. And then I'm running steps in that environment. So I have the logs and the exit codes for each of the steps here. I can see what's going on easily, quickly. And because that's all that's happening, the one thing to remember when setting up or troubleshooting is if you can do something in a local Linux, Mac, Docker environment, you can do it here. So now we've covered the UI basics. We are going to get into some change validation. And what we're going to do is talk a little bit about a situation. So I'm a developer in this situation. I have a dev bank app here. So it's a fully fledged app we use, and then a production cluster over here. It's a bank of ions, what we call it. And I'm trying to get a change out to my production app, skip my dev cluster while I'm working on this bank app. In my case, I really want to get something out before I head out. I don't want to have to go through the full approval process. So I made a few changes to get production access on a non-main branch. I know the change and I promise it is okay. But this separation of concerns is something that DevSecOps does mandate. Let me go to the pipelines page again. And you can see I actually have this blocked here. The pipeline checks for this, and because it violates the policy, it doesn't process at all. So config policy management lets me enforce that policy that I can't get access to these credentials on the main branch when I'm not in the main branch. It allows developers to be empowered to own their own configs, pipelines, while DevSecOps and platform teams both know there won't be any security or policy adherence issues. In your case, you might have hundreds of repos and you want a holistic approach without having to treat them all as separate entities. Here you can have cohesion for some rules that you want to apply across the organization. Now, this developer, in this case, has to play by the rules, but not to worry, there are plenty of other ways to reduce workflow duration and increase throughput. And I'm going to jump into the IDE for this. So I'm the IDE as a developer. This is my command center. This is where I spend most of my time. I fix up the issue I had in the config, and I'm going to kick off some work. Now that we're adhering to those policies, we want to start running checks on the actual source code. And from the developer shoes, this feedback is even quicker and easier with our Visual Studio Code plugin. You might recall when we hit the pipelines page at the top of the demo, I said this is where the operator can get a bird's eye view from across the org. But as a developer, this is what I need. I might not need all of that. I'm working on what I have open in my IDE. And I can see the pipeline is running up here without having to jump around, navigate to a UI, whatever. The first piece of validation I'm running is a linting job. With that linting, I want to get shallow feedback. I want to get it fast. If this doesn't compile or it has an issue, let's fail quick. I'm running on every branch in every situation. In this Java check style, I'm also utilizing dependency caching. So I could reduce the time spent on the process installing dependencies to nearly zero when our packages haven't changed. This might also be a really small resource class. Maybe I don't need much available for this really simple piece of work. I'm dropping that as a breadcrumb because we're actually going to validate that assumption later. But so I'm provisioning just one quick job. It's great from an operational perspective because if this does fail, I don't provision more resources. The pipeline stops here. Perks of having everything be on demand. But good news, the linting does pass. Now that we've run that quick superficial feedback, we want to run some more intensive work, get deeper feedback on what changed and see if it's okay to get out. So I'm going to move on to some of the unit test suites. Here on the Python unit test, as a developer, I want to see green all the time, but sometimes things do not go to plan. I can see there's a failure on the unit testing job for the workflow that is ominously named branch failed test. Once I see the failure, the name of the game here is reducing mean time to recovery. The first line of defense is here in the IDE. Usually I can actually get all I need right here. As a developer, I don't want to jump back and forth to troubleshoot. I just want to figure out things as quickly as possible. So jump into the unit testing job. I can actually see all the test results here. I can open up the job details and actually get the failed test results right here in my IDE from that test that ran in CI. I get all the logs and exit codes as well. So I can jump into the details tab, see the same thing I can see in the UI, get that job feedback right here in the IDE. So really great for a developer's workflow because I'm focused on my change and what happened on this test suite that I ran. I really just want the feedback I need without context switching. Everything is right here. I get all this information from the UI right here. I do have another way to troubleshoot as well. I can rerun the job with SSH enabled. So maybe I need to actually get into the build container and see what's going on. Maybe check some environment variables, check out the correct path for something, or just do more broad troubleshooting. I can do this all right here. This is quick and easy. It gets me right in. It opens up a terminal session right here for me to do all that. The actual job that's rerunning, I'm SSH into the actual environment. So all these options as a developer let me fix the failure as quickly as possible. Now, I do want to note that everything we just saw is also available in the UI. I can click over here. It will direct me to the same test that failed. So I get all that information as well inside of the UI. It just depends on how I want to consume it. I can see that rerun with, I can see the SSH job running. I can see the rerun with SSH as well. Rerun the workflow from the start, from the failed. And this is actually a new release too. That's really cool. So rerun the failed test only. I want to really highlight the SSH debugging piece and not undersell it. Developers absolutely love this. In addition to making them happy, let's platform teams enable developers to troubleshoot on their own without having to run something up to a central team that might be at bottleneck. Really, it's a win-win. So that was a failed test and how we can speed up time to recovery once we see green. But of course, there are going to be times, hopefully more often than not, where all the tests do pass. So I'm going to see another unit test job back here. I'm going to run to one of these past workflows. I could see this unit testing job, which is all green. So in addition to dependency caching, which I mentioned lets you speed the job up by not having to reinstall dependencies from scratch, we have a couple other things to help reduce workflow iteration and keep the developers happy. We have a built-in test splitting mechanism that lets you split up all the tests over however many nodes that you define. And you can split this by timing data, so it also finishes close to the same time instead of splitting at random. You can see here I have some tests, I'm splitting it over 3 nodes, but if you have something like 1,000 unit tests and it's taking you 30 minutes, you can split that whole thing over parallel nodes in the matter of a few minutes, get that rapid feedback on the validation that you need to run. And after we run the validation of the source code itself, so that unit testing job did pass, we need to produce an artifact and send it somewhere. This is a very typical cloud native approach. So I'm building a Docker image in this job and updating the cluster for the dev cluster in the next job, and then I'm running some end-to-end tests after that. So what's happening here, they're pushing this to a self-hosted Nexus instance. This is going to EKS, and this is running some Cypress tests to be a little more specific. Into this Nexus one, I'm building the image, sending it to Nexus, but how do I let Nexus know it's us? I'm getting a short-lived credential using OIDC from a Vault instance. OIDC and working with Vault or secrets managers are really common requests from DevSecOps folks. And then for the building Docker image piece, you can see this thing builds in 10 seconds. Another speed lever that we're implementing here is Docker layer caching. With everything being ephemeral, we want to also make sure we don't have to build everything from scratch. This lets us cache Docker layers and feels really similar to when you're building a Docker image locally and you see the cache hits. So it's a really efficient way to reduce workflow iteration. And then I'm pushing that image out. So let's move back and move along in that pipeline journey. On this update cluster job, we're in the same process to authenticate with another resource. Again, this is our dev cluster in EKS. Because I'm on dev branch, I have access to the dev credentials for that, which is certainly keeping the security folks happy. They don't have what I don't need. Going ahead and I'm running some kubectl commands down here to get this thing deployed. And then down here, I'm also updating my status in Atlassian Compass. Although this could really stand in for any third-party tool where you want to get information to. And we're doing this with an API key through a built-in Vault instance that CircleCI provides. So you can access and restrict those as well. We talked about OIDC, external Vault, branch guarding, a lot of these functionality, all these things are options. There are times like this where there's several potential approaches and there's not necessarily a right or wrong. It's a great example of an opportunity to consult with our team on how to set this up and future-proof that approach and really get everything stood up in a repeatable way. Making secrets management in particular secure and dry for you makes DevSecOps happy, it ensures policies. Platform teams happy because it's repeatable, and developers happy because they don't need to worry about either of those things. They just focus on getting their changes out. And then really to close the loop on the pipeline that we're following, the last step to ensure the deployability is going to be those end-to-end tests that we're running. So running those Cypress tests on the dev environment itself to make sure it's deployable state before merging over to main. Now that the pipeline's done, I'm going to jump back into the config and talk shop a bit. What we're going to be seeing is standard YAML here. Let me make this a little bigger. Perfect. This YAML is going to be familiar for folks who work with modern DevOps or infrastructure tools. In terms of things that live inside of the config, the mandatory pieces are workflows and jobs, and then as well as a version stanza with the 2.1. The workflow has a name, so we're looking at the main workflow, and that coincides to what we just saw in that workflow in the UI, and then a list of jobs. And with a few keys, I'm just going to collapse a few of these, we're able to add in things like a dependency graph. So the require stanza decides which job goes first, and then the credentials that I want to make available to that job in particular. So giving access to groups of credentials. And you'll be able to see that I'm using the CircleCI plugin as well down here. If I hover over the workflow here, I could see more information on what it is. If I do something like change the name of a job and it doesn't match what's defined in the job stanza, it lets me know. Really, this is easy feedback for whomever's working on the config. It's nice you don't need to commit to see any of these config errors and get really good linting and then tips and information. So I mentioned the workflow refers to the job stanza. You can see here, this one is not being used, so I can actually take this thing out. And then I'm going to jump into that job we just saw up there. So Python check style. It defines the execution environment. That's a really simple job. This is defined in a separate executor stanza, but you can also just define it directly here. And then the steps that I want to run inside of that environment. Simple as that to get up and running. For a developer, this is all really easy, quick to read, really easy to understand what's going on. Now, if I have some things that I know I want to use in multiple jobs, I can also make things reusable. It starts to get exhausting if I want to update something over 20 jobs. Now I have to do it one by one. So if I know I'm going to use this Python executor, I can define it in the executor stanza, and you'll be able to pull in this Docker image. Anything public or private Docker image you can pull in. And you can also do this with commands. So if I jump down to this command stanza here, I have some bash script logic built out to get our credentials. Instead of having to put this everywhere and potentially make updates to them all individually, I can just drop this command name, load credentials into the different jobs and invoke it there. So DevX platform teams can use this to make it easier to enable developers by removing some complex logic out of the actual job and just managing it in one central place. Now, the concept of managing in one place, it works great here for single configs and projects. But what if we want this policy to be global? Well, this is a great opportunity to take this reusable configuration approach and do just that with orbs. Orbs are CircleCI's package manager, reusable configuration as code. They are hosted outside of the config in a registry, public or private to your organization, and you can pull them in with this orb stanza down here. They're all versioned, they're all in source control, and they can be mandated with config policy management if required. So if you're looking for the first thing to try out with CPM and you're dizzy because there's so many it's so exhausting thinking of all the possibilities of things you can mandate in a config file, this is a great place to start mandating orb usage. You can see I'm bringing in a few orbs here. These are both certified at partner orbs. This means that CircleCI or the partner manages and maintains, make sure these cover broad use cases. I'm going to use the Maven orb as an example. We can see that all I need to do is pull in a command right here, and it sets up caching without having to worry about the logic of how to approach that. Runs really simply. I add in the step that I want to run with caching enabled. And if I jump over to the orb registry, so back to the UI for a second, you can see a huge list of orbs to choose from here, really all the common tools, all the things you want to do. But if I could jump into that Maven one, I can get a little more insight into what's actually going on. This is the one we're using. We're using the with cache command. Again, it could be a full job as well if you want to just replace the entire job. And I can see the command source down here. So what is checking the source control for this version, what command is actually being run, as well as the optional parameters to be able to add in and to customize. The registry also has orbs created by our community, and they cover a lot of other use cases. The orb registry is the first place I go before any other docs or anything if I'm wondering how I might approach something. If I was doing a config from scratch as well, I would really lean onto these best practices very heavily. And if you're looking to standardize and scale with best practices, make some of your own, use a third-party ones. It's really a good opportunity as well to work with our support and figure out the best way to approach that at scale. So we've talked about everything from config to deployment. Now we're going to move on to making sense of things beyond a single run. And the Inside Stash is the de facto place to go to really see it all. It helps DevX platform teams see what's going on across the board and see trends over time. I jump in here. This is the landing page for the Inside Stash. And I see things pop up around cost control, visibility, so credit usage trends, success rates. These are great if you do have organizational goals that you want to monitor. We see a lot of teams focused on the DORA metrics, like I mentioned earlier. And you can also see some projects and workflows here with their trends. Dig deeper into the workflows that are done for this Bank of Ion project that we're looking at, as well as the Circle Demo React one I had at the top. To go a level deeper, we can also zoom in with the zoom window. zoom in on the Bank of Ion project and the main workflow here. And I'm going to jump in the main workflow, select all branches. I can hide some outliers and I can start seeing the trends. So at this point, I'm seeing the runs, the success rate, the durations. At this level of granularity, this is where I can start looking for outliers, but trying to make sense of where things might have changed and where I might be able to do some more optimizations. But jumping back to the top now, I'm going to go a level deeper into the jobs view. We see the same types of metrics, so duration, success rate, but this is all now at the job level. Another thing I want to call out here, this is a great way to get visibility into how you're using the resources provisioned. I see here the CPU and RAM usage for the job. It's a great way to manage costs. It's really visible if I'm underutilizing or overutilizing resources for pieces of work. I want to make sure I have the right size resource for the right job and find that Goldilocks zone, not to make unnecessary trade-offs between speed and spend. And I'm going to call back to that Java check style job I mentioned at the top. I can see the resource usage, the CPU and the RAM here. Maybe this is actually getting more vertical scale than it needs. Maybe I can reduce that and provide more for another intensive piece of work. So this would be a great opportunity to work with our support consulting teams on finding that perfect zone. You can see like the 2% RAM usage probably would tip me off a little bit. And then the test tab. This one's one of my favorites. I can see results for workflows, including passing and failing. It also brings some things to my attention that'd be useful to know. So flaky tests, most failed tests, and then which tests are the slowest. Overall, these are just things that I can actually use and take action on. And the last thing I want to touch on here is all this that we saw on the Insights dashboard. It's front and center. These are the types of things that we know are broadly applicable, but all this information is also accessible with the API. You can build, you can get whatever you need with a few calls. And that is it in terms of the prepared pieces. I'm actually going to jump into some other use cases, but I do want to pause to see if there are any questions being added and I can get to those. All right, I'll give everyone a second to come up with some questions. I'll check back, but I want to talk quickly about some other use cases then. I'm going to start with dynamic configurations. Let me jump into the other uses. And there we go. So dynamic config, everything we saw thus far follows a pipeline kicking off a workflow that runs end to end with the pipeline. Now, if I have a situation where I want to run some additional logic based on something like path changes for a monorepo or based on some checks to another environment, what if I want to use different configs based on some of these situations? It'd be helpful to not have to have all my pipeline parameters set at runtime in this case. Perfect use case for dynamic config. It's functionality opened up by a continuation API endpoint. So instead of having one workflow, we have multiple. We have a setup workflow that runs checks and that are needed and sets the correct parameters, and then a continuation workflow or workflows which run the work that need to be done based on those correct parameters. And there are a few reasons why someone might want to do this. This is a really good starting point, but not all inclusive. I have a monorepo, which you're seeing here. I don't want to build everything on every commit. I have a path filtering org that checks for changes, and I run conditional work based on the subdirectories that change. So great way to manage resources where there's an important change, everything's tested. Or if a README changes, you can see down here in the docs, I don't want to run anything. So I'll just run a quick little check if the README changes. Something in the middle, you only do what's relevant, balancing speedy feedback with different amount of coverage and managing resources. And the other one is you want to use CircleCI for building and managing infrastructure. I can see down here, really good example for how we do this. So we're able to spin up, tear down clusters and EKS based on branch patterns, some additional parameters that we can provide to tear things down. So it's really important for platform teams to manage their config as code. And this really helps. And if you want to not specify your config file at the time of processing, you can also run logic to check for things like tags, issues, build a config from scratch, or specify location of the one you like. So it lets you be nimble and separate concerns. And I have a question about .NET Core 6 Web API and wants to know if there is a Windows org that supports CI automation. with a Netlify integration for CD automation? It's a good question. Yeah, so there definitely are some Windows tools available. We have a Windows orb to help you run Windows logic, and we have some good pages in the docs around that. So definitely take a look, and have a Windows Docker image, but the Windows machine is probably we see most people using. So I'd jump in here and let me know if you have any further questions. And there would be certainly Netlify ones. I don't know if it's a, let me check to see if it's a certified or, yeah, a couple examples of the community for like a Netlify deployment, but it's really simple commands on Netlify. So you could also just automate that process, have a Docker image of Netlify installed and run that command you want. What I end up seeing a lot. Jump into another use case while we're waiting for some more. So mobile, we talked about different, pipelines covering different architectures and use cases, how they apply to mobile. And because we've covered all the basics, it's just a matter of applying those fundamentals to this use case. So I see environments are interchangeable. I can choose, again, the right tool for the right job. Lots of cloud hosted Mac options to choose from. So base, M1, bare metal, whatever you need for your work. I can build on Android machine image or Docker convenience image as well. And I'm running some node work as well, all in the same workflow. Something really great from a platform perspective is that you can bring all the mobile development into the fold. You don't have to manage separate tools. Everything's covered here. And there's organizational metrics and insights that can be tracked really easily across the team. Another really fun one would be Runner. I talked about in terms of build resources, you can use cloud or also self-host, and these can live together in harmony. I don't want you to think of self-hosted Runner as a different offering. It's more of a different flavor of how to approach cloud. And these can be useful for a number of reasons. A good one's if you have privilege access and controls. So you want a resource class beyond the firewall. And others if you have exotic compute, something that you need to run on. So if something really out there, something where you already have a licensed software installed on like a physical machine, you need to use that. Then again, you might also just want more control over resources. So also a very fair option. All these allow platform teams to handle whatever the different dev teams throw their way in terms of needs to support. But what I want to highlight, we call container runner here. So I have a cluster provision to run work, spins up pods as needed, tears them down, and pulls in whatever Docker image noted the config. And you can see it's the same workflow we just saw. It's the same thing, but this one's actually being run on a Kubernetes cluster that I host, and this one just on a Docker resource. So everything's exactly the same. As a developer, I'm also seeing specifying the Docker image in the same way. So really, it feels the same as using the cloud product. So it's really nice to be able to mix and match like that. So question, how does CircleCI handle static website deployments with HTML, CSS, JSS files and provide any SEO related feature tags? In terms of static website deployment, it would be, I'm not sure exactly where you're deploying, but let's say it's something like an S3, you just be able to build like your build folder and run like an S3 deployment. So it'd be really similar to just doing something inside of the job. So it would be, show you the S3. We have like an example here. So if you want to just like sync the S3 with the current state in the build folder that you have, you'd absolutely be able to do that. The SEO related feature tags, I have to follow up on, so I'll try to get someone to track that down. Get you a better answer. And the same thing goes for other like static deployments if you're using Netlify or Cell or any other thing where you have a static deployment, you want to just do that. It's the same process of just automating that, having the right folder and pushing it out to somewhere. And the question about CircleCI supporting Flutter builds, absolutely. Anything in terms of the architecture you want to run. So there should be, the one we just saw was me running React Native, but Flutter be really absolutely a similar process. I think we should have some docs around Flutter, maybe not. But really it's a matter of just like picking the environment that you want to run on and running those steps. I wonder if there are orbs on with Flutter. There we go. So we do have a Flutter orb as well to help you automate the SDK, do all those pieces. And again, it's as simple as picking the platform. So, if you want to run M1, just run a bare metal, just a base, different Xcode versions, all that automated. And then for Android, really cool. We help you do the automation there, get out to the Play Store, do code signing, do all the fun stuff. And you can also do nested virtualization. So if you need to test on emulator, you can also do that. Mobile's a really fun one because you can do the whole automation of like upgrading versions, doing different pieces. And there's a question around TV apps. How does CircleCI handle deployments to marketplace? Is this the Apple marketplace? Is a question on that? If so, we would typically recommend someone does something like a Fastlane, and we have full docs on Fastlane, but you can upgrade the versions. Yeah, perfect. So for all the mobile, the concepts are really the same. So you'd be upgrading versions with Fastlane, typically doing code signing, and then some logic you'd build out. So something we'd probably work with you on to find the right approach and send you the right docs. But generally speaking, just automate that process in a really similar manner to whatever you would do locally to deploy something. If you want to get something to test flight, get something to the app stores, all the same process. So we have plenty of docs around mobile as well. So this would be a good good examples here. Let's see. But I will say that the easiest approach is if you're using Fastlane too. It's really integrated, makes the process very easy. If you have any other questions on that, we can follow up as well. Yeah, TLDR, if you're trying to do something and you can do that, something in a local Linux Mac Docker environment, different machine, like you can just do the same thing and port it over to CircleCI. So we really see it all. One of the benefits that they could be in such a broad platform and having millions of builds per day that we see is nothing's really a surprise. I also recommend if you're looking to play around with CPM, we do have some docs here with some helpers. So if you want to play around with like soft failing for people using different resource classes, mandating orbs, we have some good helper starter policies that are really great. So these are all living in source control, automate that process of like deploying to your organization. The question on what kind of reports does CircleCI support? Follow up, what kind of reporting are you looking for? Like at a job level, if instead of job level, in terms of the reports you're looking for, you could definitely save something as an artifact. So if I look at these tests here, I'm going to have some artifacts. Where's this? Do I have? Oh, I don't have tests on this. Oops, let me jump to this other pipeline. So I have artifacts I can store here. So I have my JUnit reports here, but if you have an HTML, say it's an artifact, really under the hood, you could save anything as it's an S3 bucket. So you could format, I see a lot of folks doing like an HTML if you want to have a screenshot of like a snapshot or a screenshot of the web page or something to be able to consume, you could save it as an HTML, and then also access artifacts after the fact with the API. If you also want to port out logs somewhere, extensibility is going to be huge. So I mentioned like sending something at Atlassian Compass, just something to Datadog, Honeycomb, you name it, absolutely able to do that. Stream that in, send out webhooks on pass failure, terminal state for workflow jobs. So really piece it all together. So something that could help architect as well, depending on needs. There appear to be, I'll give it another minute, see if there are any other questions. I would say speak now, forever hold your peace, but really you could just ping me on anything, get your question answered. All right, that looks to be about it. So I want to thank everyone for joining. Let me know if you have any additional questions. Happy to set up some other time to dive deeper into some potential, if something fits your needs a little bit better, just let me know. And we can architect it out. Love it. Thanks everyone for joining.